The Guardian have become Britain's anti-white Radio Rwanda, and in their increasing desperation to control the narrative about illegal immigration and mass deportations, they've released some of the most absurd and downright evil articles I've ever read. We're going to go through them this week on Tomlinson Talks. So The Guardian publishes some treacherous garbage, but this might be the most evil article I've ever read, and it's written by Zoe Williams, who is the avatar of middle-class feminism in Britain and the luxury beliefs that she preaches, which inflict atrocities entirely preventable on lower classes. And this comes after the Bell Hotel in Epping is forced to continue housing fake refugees, fake asylum seekers, illegal migrants, at the behest of the local residents, even after one of them, the Ethiopian who was charged with a sex offence 8 days after breaking into the country, has now been convicted and awaits sentencing for attacking a 14-year-old girl. And this came, the ruling that they have to stay there, came because the Home Office employed a lawyer to argue that the rights of the fake asylum seekers actually supersede those of the local residents. Lord Justice Bean, who ruled in this case, is, by the way, one of the leading Fabian socialist lawyers in this country, so the judicial system is entirely ideologically captured in Britain. But the Home Office argued that under the European Convention on Human Rights, written into British law thanks to the 1998 Human Rights Act, passed by Tony Blair, and the handbook for which for lawyers to apply was written by Keir Starmer when he was a human rights lawyer, means that, quote, relevant public interests in play are not equal and are fundamentally different in nature. So, the concerned parents depicted here in this photo are subordinate, in the eyes of the state, to foreign sex offenders who break into our country. So, they are also subordinate in the eyes of Zoe Williams. Quote, far-right anger over asylum hotels is destroying the very idea of refuge, and that's probably the goal. The subtitle, the court ruling on the Bell Hotel does not just legitimise anti-migrant sentiment, it also risks erasing a whole category of people. Yes, we should erase illegal migrants, we should erase fake refugees, we should erase asylum seekers who have no right to be here, because we should repeal every law that makes these foreign criminals possible to exploit our country. They just shouldn't be in my country in the first place. Zoe Williams, the end goal of her ideology, is to battery farm foreign sex offenders at your expense because she believes that they are the oppressed people. And I am not mischaracterizing her views at all. She has a genuinely insane Rousseauian view that everyone is a blank slate and that the criminal is the victim of society. And she writes this. She says, when the High Court ruled this week that the Bell Hotel in Epping could no longer be used to house asylum seekers, the triumph of anti-migrant zealots looked a little unwarranted, or at least premature. Nigel Farage hoped loudly that the ruling would provide inspiration to others across the country. He's now come out and backed mass deportations, which is encouraging. Tabloids and GB News called it in all caps a victory, while Epping locals popped champagne on the hotel's doorstep. Meanwhile, the ruling itself felt impermanent and technical more than principled. The judge ruled that Somani, the company that owns the Bell, itself run by a Muslim migrant, had not notified the council of its intended use. It was hardly an endorsement of the general proposition, memorably spelled out by Robert Jenrick recently, that men from backward countries who broke into Britain illegally pose an active threat to its daughters. There is absolutely nothing that you should be able to agree with here unless you are taking the side of these men from backward countries who pose a threat to the daughters, who have already proven to pose a threat to the daughters, because one, ahead of time, they telegraphed their predatory intent by filming our women and girls on nights out, dressed in ways that would be considered immodest by Islamic standards, to market the services of people smugglers on TikTok and Instagram, and because the Ethiopian who sparked the Bell Hotel protests in the first place has now been convicted of a sex offence. What's insane as well is that the prosecuting lawyer even conceded in the case that he is a man of good character, having had no prior convictions. He was here for 8 days. The fact that he got a conviction after 8 days speaks volumes to the fact that none of these men are of good character. Their first act in this country was to break the law. They are obviously a threat. They do not need to be here. Every single crime they commit is a consequence of state policy, and so we should use state policy to remove them. But Zoe does not want that to happen. She writes, and while the victory calls were resounding, there was no answering message of defeat from those who support asylum seekers. Nobody who thinks hotels are a sound and humane way to accommodate refugees. Liminal, often squalid, eye-watering expensive for the Home Office, they hardly scream, welcome. Actually, I think hotels are a humane way to accommodate refugees. I think they are far too generous. I think the 4-star Britannia Hotel in Canary Wharf is not suitable accommodation for a bunch of foreign criminals. I think a cold camp on a disused military barrack shortly before their standing Ryanair flight to whichever backward hellhole they came from is more than sufficient. I shouldn't be paying my taxes towards the collective pot of billions to be housing these foreign chancers who themselves are lording over us the fact that they are in our country and exploiting us with free phones, new trainers, and a cushy Deliveroo job that they pay no tax on. Anyway, Zoe again thinks this is perfectly acceptable because the end goal of safe and legal routes or humane accommodation for asylum seekers is them being here permanently. The entire point of her ideology is to have the entire world move here until such a point where we are all compressed into some giant meatball on Parliament Green. Because that's the only way we're going to house the entire world in our rainy little isle. Yet, she writes, the ruling has been seismic, with the victory cries of the right are logical. Within 24 hours, the Home Office's plans on migration have been put into disarray. It is obliged to house asylum seekers while their claims are being heard, and at the end of March, there were 30,000 people living in about 200 hotels. Why are there 30,000 people in 200 hotels in my country that I and the rest of the law-abiding tax-paying public are paying for? None of them should be here. They should all be deported. The plan has been to phase out hotels by 2029, a date that made no sense unless its real aim was to kick the whole issue into the next term. This is why Robert Janrick resigned from his post as migration minister in 2023. He said the Rwanda plan was a dead cat distraction. It wasn't intending to solve the problem. They don't want to solve the problem. They just want to delay and mitigate negative public perceptions to the point where we just all quietly forget about this, quietly forget that we are paying for the hotels for foreign criminals so that these men can linger in our system and stay here forever. Now, the Bell Hotel has to be emptied by 12th of September. No longer. Congratulations to Zoe. I'm sure that she's positively creaming at the thought. As other local councils follow Epping's lead, the government will be left scrambling to disperse people into the local authority housing at very short notice, with a duty to keep track of them, but no obvious way of doing so. Literally just stick them in a tent and then deport them. It's possible. You can repeal all the laws, you can commandeer military planes, or even pay a budget airline to pack them all aboard with a couple of armed guards, and you can send them to either a third-party detention location like the Ascension Islands or the Isle of Pitcairn, or you can threaten them with doing that until they procure their documents or allow themselves to be identified to be sent back to the countries where they belong. But again, Zoe doesn't want this. More than this, the ruling has solidified a sense of legitimate citizen anger against refugees. Good. Good. We shouldn't be exploited by people who feign oppression, who have been through multiple safe countries, who have no right to be here. Only you think this is a bad idea because you're a demented open borders globalist. Since the Southport riots, there has been a familiar ratchet. Hard-right provocateurs generate real-life protests, often from great distances, because when you're organising on Telegram, anyone can count as a local resident. Fun fact, one guy who was trying to incite violence during the Southport protests and riots on Telegram was himself a Pakistani national posing as an EDL member and a racist. So this goes both ways. But yet again, the idea that hard-right provocateurs from out of town stirred up these protests is nonsense. His Majesty's Fire and Constabulary governing body already noted that a disproportionate amount of children, women, and locals were involved in all of the protests following Southport, because it was an atrocity that happened in a northern town around other northern towns where other atrocities, like the ongoing and historical Pakistani grooming gang scandal, had been plaguing the local community for decades. So no, this isn't just ginned up by a bunch of far-right misinformation. This is substantive concerns from the local people that are not being addressed, and you just calling them racist does not make them go away, Zoe, no matter how much you wish it did. Demonstrations and rioters themselves are often explicitly Islamophobic. Islamophobia was a term invented by the Muslim Brotherhood, according to an ex-jihadist and Dr. Giles Capel, to insulate the jihadist activities that they were performing to try and re-establish a caliphate after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, in the same way that Zionism was insulated by charges of anti-Semitism, and gay rights activism was insulated by charges of homophobia. They wanted to cloak their movement in the similar veneer of legitimacy to wet liberals like yourself. And she says, when they don't muster in an asylum hotel, they gather at a mosque, and are used as proof that this is the natural stance of the average Briton. Commentators pass these explosions as a mixture of hard right agitating and authentic local feeding. Unknowable what the ratio is, they agree sagely, and the anger, being dramatic and observable, grows in stature. 1, that's a poorly written sentence. 2, 90% of the constituencies in this country want legal migration reduced, and that's when they underestimate it by a factor of 10. They think it's 70,000 rather than 700,000, and they think the overwhelming majority of migrants are illegal rather than legal. So they get the numbers wrong and they still want them gone. Also, according to YouGov, very recently, 53% of the British public said that Islam is incompatible with being British. So it's not some fringe Islamophobic view being stoked by far-right provocateurs online. This is the British public who've been brought into contact, and thereby conflict, with the third world and its culture and customs, and have gone, no thank you very much, they all need to go home. Zoe writes, it's now impossible to have a debate about immigration without acknowledging this huge wellspring of fury, and it is simply not the done thing to ask whether this rage is justified. Anger, being authentic, never has to explain itself. It's entirely justified. It's justified by all the sexual assaults that never needed to happen, by all the money we spend on housing and feeding and the legal fees for these fake refugees. It's justified by the amount of money spent on benefits for people who never needed to be here in the first place. It's justified by the general social decay, the aesthetic degradation of our towns and cities. The fact that if I step outside my home, the world on my doorstep feels unfamiliar to me, and that we were never asked for any of this. We were never asked to have our country demographically disfigured, culturally scarred, and economically impoverished. Actually, we, whenever given the opportunity, said, no thank you, we don't want this to happen, and we were punished anyway. So yes, the anger is justified. This court ruling, she writes, is both illustrative of and instrumental in the solidity of fury as political instrument. The judge granted the injunction after hearing the local council's complaints that planning law had been breached in changing the site's use, but underlying this, the council also cited disruption caused by recent protests. An asylum seeker from the hotel was accused, now convicted, of sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl, and concerns were raised about potential future threats. Since then, the hotel has become a site of protest, with large groups gathering with flares, flags, and signs. Extrapolating from an assault accusation that all asylum seekers pose a danger is racist. Really, Zoe? Really? Number 1, every single sexual assault committed by a foreign national is preventable. It is a consequence of government policy. If they were never here in the first place, the life of that woman and girl would not have been ruined. And some men, because this happens too. So, every single one of these crimes is preventable, avoidable, and the government and the people who agitate, like yourself, to bring these foreign predators in are to blame just as much as the foreign predators are themselves. And number 2, the idea that this is just some fringe view, when in the last 4 years, sex offences from foreign nationals have increased by 62%, absolutely disgraceful. You know this is happening. I'm sorry, I can't believe that you don't read these headlines, because the coverage of this is ubiquitous across Britain now, because pretty much everyone I know, many of the women I know, have a story about being pursued or assaulted by some foreign man who doesn't respect boundaries in the same way that your average British chap does. And so the idea that you, a diehard feminist who apparently protects women's rights against sexual assault, cannot distinguish between 10 years ago, when this wasn't as severe, 5 years ago when this wasn't as severe, and now, I just think you're disingenuous. I think you're peddling an agenda that ultimately endangers women and girls by importing foreign sex offenders who never needed to be here in the first place. But one of the most disgusting parts about this is where she blames the victims. There are concerns about other public disorder charges, but that sort of offence can be self-fulfilling. If your accommodation is regularly surrounded by a small, hostile mob that sometimes wants to set fire to it, it's probably quite difficult to slot into a normal, law-abiding life, or even know what a law-abiding life looks like in this country you have escaped to, having heard it was civilized. So because people protest outside asylum hotels saying, I don't want these foreign criminals housed at my expense near a school, this causes the foreign criminals themselves to go out and commit sexual assault, according to Zoe. Bear in mind, the protests only started after the sexual assault was already committed, and he has now been convicted. But she genuinely believes that all of these people, deep down, are identical to you and me. There is no such thing as someone who is ontologically a criminal, irredeemably so. That everyone is fundamentally good, And therefore, from this original position of fundamental goodness, they must have fallen out of Eden thanks to the hidden hand of oppression, thanks to economic inequality, a lack of education on women's consent, the happenstance of geography, having been born in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Afghanistan, Somalia, or any of these other backward hellholes that reliably produce sex offenders that then come to our country and prey on our women and girls. And so, given that we're all blank slates, if a criminal commits a crime, it is the victim and the society that produced the victim, not the offender, which somehow is at fault. Because we, enlightened Western liberals, know better. And so we must have done something wrong. We must not have been inviting enough or accepting enough. We must have somehow failed this person because they didn't integrate or assimilate. And this is genuinely the belief of all the people in the government, in the Home Office. This is the belief of former anti-extremism advisor Dame Sora Khan, who wrote a report with communist group Hope Not Hate last December that said that depicting foreign invaders across the channel as, quote, fighting age males is a far-right conspiracy and is itself a barrier to integration. So by accurately characterizing the predatory intent of these men, by breaking from the nonsensical liberal anthropology of the blank slate and recognizing that certain cultures and nations and family formation practices create a low impulse control, low IQ foreign predators, by acknowledging all of this, you have committed a sin against liberalism and you are actually causing them to be criminals. You noticing differences is the problem, not the differences themselves. The problem is never the crime, the problem is you complaining about the crime. They genuinely believe that you identifying the fact that these men are more likely to be criminals makes them criminals. This is how liberals think. This is how our government thinks. This is why they think the rights of asylum seekers, fake refugees, illegal migrants trump the rights of these residents, these law-abiding, tax-paying, concerned parents and their children. They think their rights are subordinate, their right to being safe, to having their state represent their interests, they think that is all subordinate to making the entire third world as British equal as you and me. And this is the opinion of Zoe Williams, this is the opinion of the Guardian, this is the opinion of our state. She says, completely absent in this debate, which apparently we are all too frightened to have, and yet we have constantly, is any sense of a better idea. The better idea is they all have to leave. The better idea is that we just stop importing foreign sex offenders. The better idea is that Britain is full. That lots of people live here that are not going to input a culture or a family structure that is going to produce Britain at the end of it. The idea is that they have put an entirely different meat into the sausage factory, and the sausages coming out the end of it are inedible. And so, they should go elsewhere. They should have their benefits taken away. They should have their citizenship stripped if they are not conducive to the public good, per the Shamima Begum ruling. They should have indefinite leave to remain removed. They should have all of their benefits taken away, their legal aid taken away. They should be either deported if they are a criminal, or encouraged to leave if they are unwilling to live according to our culture and are not a part of our national tribe. And if they break the law while trying to stay here by trying to practice their own culture, they should be deported like every other criminal. That is the alternative I'm here to present, Zoe. And I know you don't like that alternative because your delusional ideology and your demented account of human nature, which is a total aberration for all civilizations before this present moment, thinks that it's actually better to import foreign sex offenders and then blame the victims rather than safeguard children, 14-year-old girls, from being sexually assaulted by African rapists. Completely demented. And yet she writes, if the problem with refugees is that they arrive illegally, would it help to have more legal routes? No. Because the purpose of safe and legal routes is not, as you're saying, to determine the legitimacy of the refugees. It is just because you want them here in the first place. Now, I think the refugee scheme has been exploited. However, we can draw qualitative distinctions between the type of people that we've taken in. I hope Hong Kong regains its sovereignty from the communist Chinese. I hope the Hong Kongers go home eventually. However, the Hong Kongers have not caused any problems. Have you noticed there's no Hong Kong grooming gangs? Have you noticed there's not some great spate of sex offences committed by exiled Hong Kongers to the British Isles? Funny that, isn't it? Even the Ukrainians have, despite the country being basically a mafia state at points in its history, they haven't committed a lot of crime while they've been here. It's only the men from Africa and the Islamic world that seem to be committing these vast amounts of violent and sexual crimes. And so, they shouldn't be here. I don't care whether or not they have the appropriate paperwork. Replacement migration is not better just because they're conducting it through safe and legal routes. If the hotels are the issue, she says, could we not work towards dispersal in the first instance and much faster processing of claims? Yeah, great idea. Stick them in neighborhoods and schools. I'm sure the sex offences will go down them. Again, she doesn't care about keeping women and girls safe. She just wants more foreign men dispersed throughout our country. Because she has this demented idea that this will somehow be better. Because, like Gus O'Donnell said to David Goodhart in 2010 in Oxford, Gus O'Donnell, the former cabinet secretary under Blair and Brown, his duty is not to national well-being, but to maximising global welfare. And the means by which he did this was to lobby the Treasury for the most open borders immigration policy possible. These people are ideologically possessed traitors who would like our country full of strange foreign criminals. She says, is there no world in which we could engage imaginatively with the violence and upheaval that people are fleeing and pull together to support them until they're legally able to support themselves? If you, as a man, are fleeing war in your country, you are a coward, especially without your wife and child. We also do not have any moral obligation to take in millions of people from failed states around the world. Do you know why those states have failed? Largely because the people in them suck. Because if there were entire countries filled with rocket scientists, doctors, engineers, and budding humanitarians, they would be better countries. But they're not. They're dysfunctional. They're filled with people with terrible family habits, awful customs, alien cultures, who are incompatible with our way of life and will just make our country worse, so they do not belong here. She says, that seems to be the reasonable expectation with Ukrainian refugees. If we can't extend the same empathy to those from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Bangladesh, can anyone at least explain why? Yeah, because they're Muslim. Because they're not Europeans currently at war. Because Ukrainians have not been given indefinite leave to remain. They will return home once their country is no longer at war. Pakistan, despite being an Islamic hellhole, is not currently at war. Afghanistan is full of jihadists who quite like to kill us. Iran, this shouldn't even require explanation. Bangladesh, why should we be taking any asylum seekers from Bangladesh just because they pretend to be gay? No, none of these people belong here. They don't belong here, especially at my expense. Would a refresher in the political context of those countries help? No, they do not need to be here. They do not belong here. Their culture does not produce our country at the end of it. Instead, their culture produces Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Bangladesh, where cousin and child marriage is common, where they stone rape victims to death, and where they have death for apostasy or blasphemy. No thank you, I don't want any of them here. If the problem is the numbers, can anyone explain how many asylum seekers they would like instead? None. None. And that's the answer you're petrified of. None. It's perfectly reasonable to say that asylum seekers, legitimate ones, should settle in a country in their continent of origin. And guess what? We are the furthest possible nation for all other nations except for Ireland. So they go through plenty of safe countries that are more culturally proximate than we are, and so they can go there if they have a legitimate claim. Otherwise, they can stay where they are. She says, we currently rank 5th when compared to European nations in the absolute number of asylum claims received, and 17th when the numbers are adjusted for population. Should we be 20th? Yeah, what's the lowest possible number? Is it 20th? If so, yeah, we should be 20th. Also, the absolute number of asylum claims received. Why should we want to be number one? Why do you want us to be number one? Why do you want to pack us to the rafters with foreign strangers, Zoe? At no point in this have you actually justified your moral claims. The blank slate morality is just latent in her suppositions. But the reason this is an evil article is not just because this blames victims of sexual assault for their own sexual assault by foreign men who didn't need to be in the country in the first place, but it's also a really stupid one because we are talking at complete moral cross purposes. Alistair McIntyre predicted this in After Virtue. When you drill down to the moral bedrock of various arguments being made by, let's say, the left and right, or liberals and traditionalists, blank slatists and notices of differences, the terms are incommensurate. We're just going to talk across purposes forever. Eventually, we are two parallel trains running on parallel tracks, and when the tracks converge, we will collide, and one will stay upright and the other will tip. And I think Zoe's demented morality, considering the awful consequences that it produces, will itself tip in the end. She writes, does anyone want to resile from the 1951 UN Refugee Convention? Sure. We can at least amend it and use opposition of leverage as a great big donor in the UN to say they should seek asylum in their continent of origin. That would seem to be implicit in Reform UK's promise to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, but would any party organisation that doesn't want that care to explain how it is executing its duty towards refugees and plans to do so in the future? We don't have one. We don't have one. It's entirely dependent on whether or not we would like to take people in. We don't have a duty. There is no such thing as international law. It has no binding power. It is literally just a spell that our ruling class cast upon themselves, and that spell has been broken, because we've seen the abhorrent consequences it produces. The problem with anger as a political instrument, she says, well, one of the problems alongside the violence, is that it's never called upon to be articulate or constructive. It would undermine its own strength if it were. I'm sure you're going to apply the same standard to the pro-Palestine mob that have been smashing up banks and defacing businesses and chanting for intifada and from the river to the sea in my capital city, and basically promising to commit October the 7th again in Britain if given the chance. I'm sure you're going to apply that same standard. No, of course not, because you're a sophist for whom there is no truth but power. There was another element of the campaign that led to this ruling, which is subtle but important. The erasure of the category of refugee and asylum seeker. Yeah, because you've cried wolf one too many times. The definition is stretched beyond all meaning. Originally, these laws were meant to apply to Dutch Jews fleeing the Holocaust, and now it's applying to Pakistani paedophiles who are claiming a right to the family life and saying it would be unduly punitive to their children if they were deported. I think they should be deported by a trebuchet, considering it's so carbon neutral. When you make the focus of your argument a hotel and its planning status, on the surface this is a battle over place. But if you take away the refuge someone is seeking, are they a refugee? If you take away the protection granted to them by the state, there is no asylum to claim. How then do we define these people? Without a political definition, do they exist? They shouldn't, because they are exploiting laws with no legitimate claim to gain access to my money and our families. So yes, this category of fake refugee, of foreign marauder, should not exist. Even though the issue is very different, it's not tactically dissimilar to the legal campaign waged against trans people, resulting in April's ruling that everyone has to use the toilets and other facilities of their biological sex. And you can see the liberal connective tissue between the intersectional issues. We should import infinity Muslims, also trans rights. It's because, deep down, they believe that we are all blank slates. And so, something like trans is the authentic expression of your freedom, whereas differences in outcome between groups in crime, in economic patterns, are proof of inequality caused by the hidden hand of oppression somewhere along the chain. So we have to oppress native Brits to uplift Muslim criminals, while also oppressing women to affirm the delusions of perverted transsexuals. Liberalism is just evil. It produces this. It is the philosophy of the blank slate, and Marxism is always nipping at its heels, telling it to hurry up with the revolution. I'm going to finish this article before I pop a blood vessel. It doesn't say you have to have no rights to live as trans. It's just unfortunately impractical for you to do so unless you stay at home. Do you still exist? Do you still have rights? You have no right for me to affirm your delusion. The problem with anger in politics is that combustion is the only way to expend the built-up energy. It's much easier to keep these things humane and civilized in the first place. Oh yeah, how dare you be angry if your daughter's sexually assaulted by an Ethiopian who's been in the country 8 days and should never be here in the first place? Didn't you realize Zoe Williams thinks that you should keep paying for his hotel fees so that she can feel better about supporting human rights? But it's too late to wish we had done that, she writes. An injection of humanity is the only way to cool things down. I don't think it's very humane to subject children to avoidable atrocities from men that should never be in the country in the first place, Zoe, and neither do most people. And that's why you've written this desperate and evil article, because you can feel the narrative sands slipping through your fingers. And it can't be soon enough. Your average Guardian columnist is afraid because they've entered uncharted territory where their old reputation destruction spells and thought-stopping cliches no longer work. They no longer have purchase. They've cried wolf one too many times with accusations of racism, sexism, fascism, and Nazism, and now they have spent all their moral currency. We do not have to take them seriously. This entire time, we could have just treated them like Freddy Krueger at the end of Nightmare on Elm Street, or David Bowie at the end of Labyrinth, and just said, you have no power over me. You're nothing. Your words are meaningless, and they evaporate into a fine glitter. And this is what David Renton, by the looks of him, a very respectable man or minion, has realised in the pages of The Guardian by saying lessons from an asylum hotel counter-protest, calling our opponents fascist, doesn't work. The admission here is that they always knew what they were doing. They could always distinguish between actual Nazis, fascists, and racists, and their political opponents that they would like to beat with the ever-thinning stick of the bogeyman of the Second World War. So he writes, earlier this month, I helped organise a protest to defend the refugees holed up at the Thistle City Barbican Hotel in London. Now bear in mind, these refugees were men from the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa who leaned out of the window with their brand new iPhones, laughing and recording the clashes between police Antifa and the peaceful parent protests who were complaining about these, in many cases, foreign sex offenders housed in 4-star accommodation at their expense. So, reminder, this man is who's on the side of people like the Ethiopian who arrived and 8 days after he broke into Britain, sexually assaulted a girl in Epping. This is the guy that wants those men to continue to be housed at our expense. Anyway, continuing. We mobilised 800 people to support the asylum seekers, all locals I'm sure, who waved back at us from the hotel to show their gratitude. On the other side of the road, about 250 people had gathered to demand the hotel be closed. Speakers there called refugees illegal, invaders, and parasites, all correct. They broke into this country. Their first act upon arrival was to break our laws. They are exploiting the law-abiding, native, tax-paying population of this country, and they were never asked to come here. And if you were a grown man, apparently fleeing war in places like Morocco or Algeria, then 1, you were a coward, 2, you were exploiting the refugee system, and you were a fake asylum seeker. You were a fake refugee, and you should not be here. He says, seeing and hearing our opponents, the anti-racists responded with a spontaneous chant of Nazi scum off our streets. Very spontaneous, yes. They sort of wrote, learn, and recite this for every single protest, no matter the context. So they chant the same thing for women protesting about the invasion of their sex-segregated spaces by autogynephilic trans activists. They chant the same thing at people who are opposing the pro-Hamas marches that have occupied Westminster every weekend and Wednesday since October the 7th, and now they're chanting it against concerned parents who do not want their daughters preyed upon by foreign men who do not belong in the country in the first place. Reminder, every single crime committed by an immigrant, legal or illegal, is a consequence of government policy. It never needed to have happened because that criminal didn't need to be in the country in the first place. And we are now number 1 in Western Europe for crimes committed by foreign nationals. David here is supporting this state of affairs continuing. I am opposed to that, and I do not care what he calls me, and neither do the good people of Epping, or the Barbican, or Canary Wharf, or any of the other protests spearheaded by the Pink Ladies and other parents up and down the country. Good on them, and shame on David. He says, which our side was able to sustain for more than an hour, this spontaneous chant. By the way, spontaneous? No. Stand Up to Racism, as depicted here, are a renter mob that work for the Socialist Workers' Party, who are funded by education and transport unions, and more than likely circuitously, because Hope Not Hate were too, funded by the incestuous network of charities that have been bankrolled by government departments like the Home Office and Department of Work and Pensions ever since the establishment of the Charities Act of 2011, which said that the purpose of a charity can be advancing the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the government is mandated to finance open borders communist organizations that agitate for the destruction of our country and feel oh so good about putting children's lives at risk from demented foreign criminals. So, he says, I understand why people wanted to express their contempt for the people who tell lies about refugees. You were the one lying. But the chant didn't strike me as effective when I heard it, and the more I have thought about it since, I am convinced that it was the wrong strategy. There were fascists present at the demonstration. One banner advertised a small hard-right group. Again, doesn't name them. So, smearing a group, as far as I know, as just fascists. And again, you're saying that the tactic wasn't effective, so the people that you and your side called Nazis are not themselves Nazis. So when you call these people fascists, do you understand that I do not take your word for this? So, no matter who you identify as fascist and Nazi, whether or not the label is correct for one given group, because you have used it as a broad brush to smear all of your political opponents, that means that you are no longer credible, and the accusation no longer has any purchase. When everyone from PewDiePie to Donald Trump to Sydney Sweeney is called a fascist and a Nazi, then nobody is a fascist and a Nazi. He says, the crowd did chant in support of Tommy Robinson. He's not a fascist. The latter, I suspect, is probably the link that organisations like Stand Up to Racism lean on when labelling the current anti-refugee movement as fascist. Many of the protests, their spokesperson has said, are organised by known fascists and Hitler admirers. But Robinson, unlike the fascists of the 1970s, doesn't leaven his speeches with reworked passages from Mein Kampf. He isn't a Hitler admirer, nor is he perceived as such by the movement. He used to boast of having a Churchill quote tattooed on his arm. He's worn a t-shirt that like says he's like a member of the IDF, even though he's not. Yeah, your average Nazi supports Israel. It's not an accusation that washes anymore. You look absurd, and they're realizing it, and they're terrified that their old tactics aren't working. The strategy of labeling our enemies fascist depends on a context where the mainstream is willing to isolate and shame Nazis. They are. You have just called everyone and their dog a Nazi, and so the word doesn't mean anything anymore. Those are not the times we are living in. So a smarter, more tailored message is necessary. And again, it was always just a smear tactic. That's what they're saying. They're saying that we applied the name Nazi to people who weren't Nazis to get you to cancel people on your own side because we knew that you did actually care about Nazis because they were immoral, they were genocidal. But now, because we have debased the currency of calling people Nazis, well, we need to find a new slip of paper that will convince you to renounce your right to exercise sovereignty over your own country, to protect your own people, and to practice your own culture. Well, sorry, now that we know that you're entirely disingenuous, now that the mask has slipped, you're never putting it back on again. He says, take Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Lord Chancellor, who recently attended an anti-refugee protest in Epping. Anti-fascists released a photograph from the protest featuring Jenrick with Eddie Butler in the background. Butler is a former election candidate for the British National Party and was the guru behind its Rights for Whites campaign in the 1990s. What was most revealing about the incident was what claimed next. A close source to Jenrick said he did not know who Butler was. Jenrick kept the photographs of his time in Epping showing on his X profile. He made it clear he wasn't embarrassed, and the story dissipates to nothing. Yeah, because he probably didn't speak to the guy. The guy probably didn't bring up that he was a BNP candidate. Like, the conversation about his views, potentially, on Jews probably weren't brought up to Robert Jenrick when his wife is an Israeli and his children are Jewish. Funnily enough, probably never even entered his mind. So you trying to smear Jenrick by having someone dodgy in a photo near him and next to him, who he probably didn't even speak to, just makes you look like disingenuous hacks. It doesn't make Robert Jenrick look bad. And good on Jenrick and his team for not falling for it. If the movement was perceived as fascist, by Jenrick or by the other conservative and reform politicians who have associated themselves with it, or by the Labour ministers who have conceded the right's main demands and agreed to close the refugee hotels and wave the flag and attempt to co-opt the Operation Raise the Colours campaign, I might add, then it would not be as confident and unrepentant as it is. Yeah, because it isn't Nazi or fascist. You have just been lying the whole time. And behind the politicians who have flattered the street movement are a much larger group who share its insistence on describing migration in negative terms, because it's terrible. If more immigration was the problem, then the people migrating would have solved all the problems in their own lands. If more Indians was the solution to Britain's problems, then those Indians would have solved all the problems in India. The fact that they have not means that the people themselves are not the solution to our problems, they do not belong here, and they should go home, especially the illegals and the foreign criminals who have committed unspeakable crimes on Britain's women and girls. I want that. Why don't you? Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, tweeted than a dozen times in August about migration. The Guardian needs a better copy editor. Every one of his messages has presented it as problematic, illegal, or the work of criminal people smugglers. In the weeks since the Barbican protest, the anti-refugee movement has kept up its momentum, calling the Nazis, even when there were fascists present at the edges of the event, has done little to undermine them. Yeah, because they're not, and we know we're not. The people out in the streets protesting know they're not. Their media vanguard and allies, like I, sitting behind a screen, know that they're not. We live by the courage of our own convictions. We don't find you to be credible moral arbiters, and so your smears just don't work anymore. They don't believe they are fascists. They don't have organised fascists in their leading circles. The term seems to them exaggerated and laughable. This is the death knell to the stand up to racism open borders grift. Yes, there aren't genuine fascists in this movement. They are actually organic. Stand up to racism is not. They do not have neo-Nazis leading these protests because the policies that you have supported have inflicted such incalculable horrors on the good-natured, law-abiding people of this country that you have radicalized them. And quite rightly so. There is a revolutionary mood to reverse the mass migration project and the multicultural appeasement project that you have pushed for decades now. And it doesn't take a fascist or a Nazi to come out against that. Things have gotten so bad in Britain now that they don't care if you smear them by saying, hey, the BNP said this 30 years ago and it's sensible, and now you're saying this obviously sensible thing. Aren't you exactly like the BNP? No. No, we're not. It's just that this issue is no longer fringe. It's no longer the domain of demented, antisocial Hitler apologists. It's just a mainstream and obvious talking point, and you look like the insane extremist for opposing it, because you are. Because it's your worldview that has brought Britain to the brink of civil unrest and civilizational decay, and we're just not having it anymore. We do not care what you call us, we know that we are in the right. You may say I'm expecting too much of one term, he writes. Even if the fascist label had worked and it got under our opponents' skins, there is no way we would know it was working. But in the 1970s, it was common for former supporters of the National Front to break with that campaign and cite its fascism as their reason for leaving. Here is one defector quoted in the East End Advertiser in 1977, and he goes on and on about the history of the far right in Britain, which is a total phantom now. This argument wins supporters, and it shields them from accusations they are extremists. The only way to confront this is to meet it head on, by rejecting any idea that foreign men or Muslims are more prone to sexual offence than their British counterparts. What an absolute and utter lie. Total lie. 47% of the sex offences committed in London now are committed by foreign nationals. That's not accounting second-generation migrants or recent grants of citizenship. And in the top 10, the rape league table, they are all Muslim-majority countries. Eritrea is roughly evenly split. But they still have sizable Muslim populations. So, we know for a fact that migrants, particularly Muslim migrants, are per capita much more likely to commit sex offences. This is why Afghanistan is 20 times more likely to commit a sexual offence, a man from Afghanistan, than a British man. And that's not even saying native British, that's just saying a man with British citizenship holding a British passport. If we had an ethnic breakdown, which we don't, it would look even more damning. We see the ethnic breakdown in the Pakistani grooming gang statistics, for example. Disproportionate rates of child sexual exploitation committed in group-based settings by Pakistani men towards white children. And it's never the same the other way around. If there were a story of a white gang systematically grooming and abusing black and Pakistani girls, then it would be national news, unending. We would have a collective racial reckoning about it, the kind that would make the George Floyd riots of 2020 look like tears over cake at a birthday party, right? The reason that hasn't happened is because it doesn't happen. So he, with this sentence, is just lying. And this lie will lead to more preventable sexual offences being committed against women and children. So it is disgraceful. The accusation of racist, fascist, and Nazi levelled at the vast majority of the population who themselves fit none of those categories is a promise to inflict avoidable sexual crimes on innocent women and girls. So if you are using it, you are continuing the state of affairs that puts women and girls at risk. The logic of the argument is racist. It relies on the assumption that just because they are migrants or asylum seekers or not white, and with no other supportive evidence, they must be more prone to sexual violence than the men who already live here. No, it relies on the fact that, on average, they have lower impulse control, lower IQ because of cousin marriage, and because their Islamic faith does not see women and girls as consideration of equal moral dignity to men. So, you are woefully misinformed, and again, you are spreading a myth that imposes a chilling effect on these necessary conversations, which then lead to policy which protects women and girls. And one of those policies is deporting every last illegal immigrant and foreign criminal currently residing in hotels or British prisons out of our country. They are not our problem, they shouldn't be here. Our own citizens take priority, thank you very much. And the simplest one-line refutation of it is to look at the men who were arrested for offences in the various race riots that followed events at Southport last year. Of those men, a staggering 40% had been reported to the police for domestic violence. Given the amount of Islamic scripture in Britain's mosques, as documented by Ed Hussein, on where to and how to beat your wife according to Sharia law, do you really want to talk about rates of domestic violence per population with the Brits versus the Islamic enclaves in our midst? I don't think you want that conversation. But also, this isn't a very effective charge because there is no domestic violence, pro-domestic violence lobby. Like, there's no we want to beat our wives Council of Britain, right? So, to try and politicize, to collectivize a few drunk thugs who decided to join civil unrest, mainly sparked spontaneously by locals who were distressed about the fact that 3 girls were butchered at a dance class by a second-generation Rwandan migrant, to try and smear all of those people, including mums in pink t-shirts, doing the conga line outside asylum hotels to peacefully protest the fact that these sex offenders shouldn't be here, to try and smear them as wife-beaters is both ridiculous and tactically unsound. So you might want to revisit the drawing board there, buddy, but I don't actually want to give you any tactical advice because your state of affairs will continue to endanger those women and girls, and I think that's utterly immoral. He says, there is, in other words, probably no single group of people, not in Britain or anywhere else, who are more prone to violence against women than the people now standing outside the hotels denouncing refugees. Try the Pakistani community. Seriously. The Ramadan Foundation head in 2016 said that British Pakistanis know that the grooming gangs are an endemic problem to their community, but they don't want to speak up about it because they don't want to, quote, be seen as siding with the white enemy. So, actually, if we want to talk about which communities are more culpable for violence against women and girls, we're going to have some uncomfortable conversations which then lead to mass deportations, of which I am in favour. This, he writes, rather than shouting Nazi, is the argument most likely to undermine the anti-refugee protests. We need to be using it in our leaflets, when we talk to people, and on our protests. Good luck. Seriously, try it. Good luck. It's not going to stop people wanting these foreign criminals out of their country, and they are absolutely right to do so, and right to ignore you going forward. Remigration is the only way. With one post on X, Elon Musk put a brick through Britain's Overton window. Now, he was responding to Steve Laws, who doesn't like me very much. He thinks I'm too soft. I disagree with Steve's policy of deporting people with one English parent and one foreign parent to whichever country the foreign parent comes from, considering they are half English and have grown up here all their lives. But that is immaterial. Because now, the conversation about returning hostile, unassimilable foreign nationals, total strangers who have made no effort to integrate and ingratiate themselves with the native host population of Britain, people who have not joined our family, joined our national tribe, people who we never wanted to be here in the first place, that conversation about returning them to their home has opened up. And this is the value, no matter my disagreements with Elon Musk on things like reproductive technology or H-1B visas in America, this is the value of Elon Musk buying X. He has swept the minds for the rest of us with more to lose than being the richest man in the world to talk about taboo issues, but policies which are absolutely necessary for salvaging our countries from the demographic, cultural, and economic disfigurement that they've undergone thanks to mass migration and multiculturalism over the last few decades. And this has Guardian columnists running scared. So this is Jonathan Liew, who usually only writes about sports for The Guardian, but when his identity as a collective immigrant appears to come under threat, he dives in front of these necessary policies and decides to identify with people that we don't want to be here, that we don't like very much, like he's a poo in front of Homer Simpson blocking the bullet. And Jonathan Liew says, what is the endgame in this toxic immigration debate? Is it friends and neighbours thrown out of the country? No, not necessarily. I disagree with Steve Laws' prescription that, quote, they all have to go back, everyone since 1945. I think we just remove the citizenship of people who fit the description of not being conducive to the public good per the Shamima Begum ruling. I think we remove indefinite leave to remain. I think we revoke all benefits, social housing, and healthcare access to people who have come to this country. If you can't support yourself, why should I support you being here? I didn't want you here in the first place. Neither did most of the public. I think we forcibly deport every single illegal immigrant and foreign criminal in our prisons, and then we proscribe certain cultural behaviours that we do not like. For example, halal slaughter, wearing the burqa. I don't think we should tolerate Islam at all in our country, thank you very much. And so if you seek to break these new laws, you will be deported like every other criminal. Or, if you want to practice those foreign cultures, customs, and faiths, you can go elsewhere. There are plenty of countries in which you can do that. You have a home to go to. This is my home. I don't want it ruined because I have nowhere else to go when you ruin it. So Jonathan Liew, though, is making, ironically, the blanket remigration policies, which I do not support, all the more likely, because he is the one who's refusing to distinguish between friends and neighbours and the class category of immigrant. For example, I would not put a friend of mine's American wife, a Hong Kong refugee fleeing communist Chinese persecution who wants to return to their home one day when the yoke of CCP rule is lifted, and a Moroccan illegal migrant who's broken into the country on the promise of sexually assaulting a British woman, as played to him in a TikTok by a people smuggling gang. I would not put all those people in the same category, because they're from different places, with different beliefs, different cultures, and they have different behaviours. But for some reason, Jonathan Liew is like, no, they're all immigrants. They all have to be welcome. They all have to be accepted, which puts you in the binary of Either you tolerate thousands of foreign sex offenders being placed in hotels at your expense, or you support the policy that says literally all of them have to go. I'm not in favour of breaking out the colour swatches, but Jonathan Liew's Guardian article, and those like him who are trying to prevent any deportations, any form of remigration that they might conceive of, the people that are trying to prevent all that are making the blanket deportation of everyone who isn't ethnically British possible. And again, I'm a sensible, squishy moderate who doesn't think that's necessary nor desirable. I don't think it would be justified to treat Raja Mia like he's a grooming gang perpetrator, for example. That would be unjust. It would fail to discriminate on the morality of their behaviours. But Jonathan Liew and the rest of The Guardian, if you want that to be the case, if you want every single non-ethnically British person to be deported, keep writing this. Because you're just going to bring civilization to the brink where that conversation is had. And he writes, this is a subtitle, the notion of remigration was abstract, but the right is dragging it towards respectability. If the goal is homogenous whiteness, then they should say it. This is the irony. It actually isn't. But he knows this as well. He knows it's not homogenous whiteness, because the Albanians are pretty pasty, and I don't want to be ruled by them either. But he knows this is the case, and so he is trying to, like in another article that we read about calling your opponents Nazis and fascists, and how they know that this isn't the case for most of them, but it's just a rhetorical smear tactic. He knows that this triggers a tripwire in the liberal sensibilities of the majority of the British public, including the people who are pro-mass deportations, pro-removing people that don't like them and they don't like from their country who don't need to be here. He knows that they recoil at the accusation of arbitrary ethnic bigotry, and so he's hoping to force them to abandon this policy. But the truth is, most people prioritize removing foreign sex offenders who are a threat to their daughters from the country over being called racist by Guardian columnists. So, if you make this a binary, they will just go, let's remove all the people who are foreign so that there are no more rapists in the country, to let's keep the foreigners here who will call me racist if I don't want foreign rapists in my country. Do you understand how this works? You're making a dialectic, and you're on the losing end of it. He writes, do they come for you at dawn or dusk, in the dead of night, or at family dinner time? Will they come with masks and shields? Or will they be kindly and sheepishly apologetic? Will they accept a cup of tea and a biscuit if offered? Will there be bags already packed by the door, protocols prepped and drilled, a list of numbers to call? Will you go quietly with dignity, or in a mess of curse words and screaming limbs? He could be describing, frankly, any of the recent arrests that the police have made, 30 a day now, 12,000 a year, of people complaining about the crimes of migration online and have been arrested for public order offences or offensive speech on the internet. He could be describing any of this because it basically fits the description of the first chapter of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, where people were arrested in the dead of night in fits of panic to force them to sign false confessions and be sent off to gulags for speaking out against the Stalinist government. And the same thing has happened in Britain. But instead, this is some sort of fevered dream about deporting people on the basis of their ethnicity, which, I might remind you, is undesirable and is entirely avoidable, but, again, articles like this make it more likely. Perhaps right now this feels all a little fantastical and far-fetched. Perhaps it feels hard to imagine the great wave of remigration lapping up on the pristine middle-class doorsteps of Stroud or Stoke Newington. We can still have a chuckle about it. Maybe there will be a nice fat relocation check, a free one-way holiday on the British government, always wanted to visit China at this time of year, and so on. But of course, if the recent history of British politics has taught us anything, it is that nightmarish visions do not stay nightmarish for long. There is a heft and a momentum behind them, a spirited and concerted effort to make the nightmare flesh. And so in our darkest daydreams, many of the non-white citizens of this country occasionally entertain an idle thought exercise. Who wants to get rid of us? Is it you, grumbling old lady on the bus? Is it you, the smartly dressed businessman, tutting quietly as two beaming mixed-race children whiz by on mini-scooters? Was that an innocent jostle in the pub queue, or the unmistakable microaggression of a seething racist who wants me gone for good? If you don't like living around these people so much, why are you here? Seriously. If you have this persistent paranoia that literally everyone means you ill, when the vast majority of people don't, you can see this with polling, you can see this with most of your daily interactions. If you think that people harbour some hidden ethnic resentment against you when you've done them nothing wrong, why are you there? Like, if I was in Japan, and I love Japan, right? Going back there for my honeymoon in a couple of weeks. If I was in Japan and I felt a sense that I wasn't wanted there by the Japanese, I would leave. Because why would I want to be in a civilization that's so low trust that I can't rely on my neighbours, where if I am in a crisis, they will not help me out? And the only reason why they wouldn't help you out is if you have not built up sufficient relationships with the people around you. Like, I don't know where Jonathan lives, right? But if he's a Guardian writer, he might well live in London, for example. He probably lives in one of the cosmopolitan metropoles that have sprung up as bastions of diversity, a bit like a Tower of Babel in the middle of our city. I would wager that because of the living circumstances and social decay in our country, he probably doesn't know his neighbours all that well, right? So if you haven't ingratiated yourself with a local community, if you aren't going to a parish church, if you aren't married to an English man or woman, if you haven't made yourself a part of our tribe, our congregation, our national family, this explains why you regard everyone around you with hostility and suspicion and contempt. And so either ingratiate yourself with these communities to the extent where, when we are deciding who our political friends and who our enemies are, and who we would like to leave and who we would like to stay, you fall on the staying side. Or you can keep calling everyone racist, you can keep regarding everyone with suspicion, you can keep using slurs like microaggressions against us, and in the dark future that your article is making inevitable, you will fall on the wrong side of it. And you know what? If offering safe passage and economic opportunities to foreign nationals comes with the price of being called racist by those foreign nationals and their children, no matter how generous and polite we are, then the price isn't worth it. Again, I'm not actually as hardline as someone like Steve Laws is on this stuff, but you're going to get more Steve Lawses than you are me's if you keep pushing this, mate. Just going to let you know. He writes, through the long years of Windrush scandals and asylum panic, entirely legitimate, Brexit and beyond, from the British National Party and local government to white nationalists proudly parading through our streets, from the Rwanda scheme to the large swap theory, have to euphemize it for YouTube, a menacing anti-migrant movement has been growling into gear, and we should probably be clear at this point that hotels and small boats were never the end game. This is absolutely true. Mass demographic displacement is not any better if the change agents have the appropriate documents. The result is still the same. If you input en masse foreign peoples, cultures, and faiths into another civilization, you won't get the same civilization at the end of it. And we had a very high trust, low enforcement, peaceful and prosperous civilization before other dysfunctional peoples brought their cultures over, especially because they were not asked to bring said cultures, and they were inflicted upon the population by our liberal governments in the first place. Of course, we knew right from the start that legitimate concerns over immigration always had a kernel of racial purification at their core. Not the case. Nope. As Eric Kaufman points out in White Shift, himself mixed from many races, he says that concerns about immigration that are couched in logistical and economic terms are usually proxies for cultural and demographic concerns. This does not mean racial purification. Yet again, I wouldn't want to be colonized by the French or the Germans or the Albanians, and they're all pretty pasty to me. It's about preserving the network of families that founded the state, that act as the custodians of its culture, as being the unquestionable host demographic majority. If a people ceases to be a majority in their own country, the country ceases to be. So, it's not about racial purification, it's about who owns our country. Is it the people it is named after, or is it the entire world in waiting to come to this country and reap its rewards without recreating the country in the first place? Is it the preservers, or is it the plunderers? I'm on the side of the preservers. The tropes and elisions of right-wing discourse, traditional British values, Londonistan, multiculturalism, were always mere euphemisms for simpler and more sinister desires. Again, if you're going to lump everyone into the same box, you're going to get the furthest possible fringe of that box. And perhaps you think that by doing that, you'll discredit the movement, but instead what you'll get, as the undeniable atrocities that result from mass immigration and multiculturalism continue to accrue, instead you're going to normalize the most violent and punitive and unjust policies associated with reversing mass immigration, rather than the sensible, reasonable, and moral policies that lots of people like Melanie Phillips or myself have been advancing. And I say Melanie Phillips because he's obviously referencing her Londonistan book there. He says, what has been left unsaid until relatively recently has been the other half of the equation, how these desires are going to be sated, the roundups and deportations, families being handcuffed and strapped into planes, the wartime-style powers that would create a permanently hostile environment for anyone deemed insufficiently native. This is the omerta that is gradually dissolving. Naturally, Nigel Farage knew what he was doing when he appeared to exclude women and children from his plan to deport 600,000 people in the first term of a reform government. Yeah, that's an error because, especially from the Islamic world, if you deport their fathers, then the children are going to grow up as resentful jihadist radicals who wreak their revenge on their host civilization when they get to the appropriate age. So, the families have to go together. As Tom Homan once said, he is a savvy enough operator to know that there is not yet a political consensus around the mass deportation of families, much less established citizens. Just wait for the further revelations, for the grooming gangs to come out, and for more immigrants to commit sex offences. Because there will be a realisation that a collective crime has been committed by the Pakistani community in Britain, who live in their enclaves but know that their husbands, brothers, sons, cousins, often the same thing, have been committing unspeakable atrocities against white English girls on the basis of their religion and race, and have, in the words of the head of the Ramadan Foundation in 2016, been burying their heads in the sand because they don't want to be seen as siding with the white enemy. Yasmin Ali Harbi Brown wrote for the Daily Mail, and she described conversations with Muslim women who justified the abuse of these girls because they said, by Allah, have you seen the way they dress? Basically, they dress so immodestly that they were asking for it. Again, Ed Hussein talking to moderate imams in Bradford, blamed the British Empire and the girls themselves for getting drunk and on drugs supplied to them by Pakistanis, and said, it's nothing to do with Islam, mate. Like, there are repeated justifications here that members of these Muslim enclaves have themselves blown the whistle on, and should be commended for that, that point to liberal individualistic Brits not having the moral language to understand how a parallel civilization harbours an ethnic and religious hatred towards them and is inflicting that violently on their children. And so the only appropriate response, if it isn't solved now, will be collective punishment, will be banishment. If you don't want that to happen, maybe address the problem. He says, recall that as recently as last September, Farage was rejecting mass deportations as a political impossibility, and it becomes clear that his intention is to shift the window of the acceptable firmly but by small degrees. I think it's actually more clear that, as Gawain Towler said, Farage is waiting for the wave to be built for him so that he can ride its crest. So I don't think Farage is himself nudging the Overton window. I think he's allowing other people to sweep the mines on his behalf and then ride on the coattails of the growing political support for that given position, because Reform already codes as the Mass Deportations Party, even though they didn't support it until recently. And hey, I'm always thankful that they catch up in the end. I just hope that they have a competent plan to carry it out. He says, in the meantime, there are plenty of loud voices happy to make the case in his absence. You do not even need to wade into the swamp waters of X and Facebook, where remigration discourse has spiraled into a kind of mass frenzy, where non-white Britons are routinely hounded with cries of deport. The MP Rupert Lowe has published his blueprint for the mass deportation of illegal migrants, and of course, once you have the levers of power, the words illegal and migrant can mean whatever you want them to mean. No, they're pretty defined. I mean, if you weren't wanted here, if you break over our border in a boat from Calais, or you overstay your visa, or you smuggle yourself aboard a lorry from the Channel Tunnel, then or aboard a ferry, then yeah, you're an illegal migrant that shouldn't be here. And all of the laws that frustrate the carrying out of deportations, according to immigration law, all of those conflicting laws should be removed and repealed. So we actually have a very clearly defined mandate for what we want to do. And it's only you that's trying to poison the well and prevent any illegal migrant and any foreign criminal from being deported. And that's such an absurd position that you're then going to cause people to leap to the position to the right of that. Good luck if you want to prevent it, not going to work. From Epping to the sea, let's make England Abdul-free, proclaimed the former Conservative and UKIP MP Douglas Carswell last week, and Douglas explained that his squishiness on migration before has now been solidified by the repeated terror attacks committed by Muslims in Britain. And I agree with him, Islam does not belong in Britain. The paradox here is that there are extreme fringe viewpoints advocated by a tiny sliver of the British population, and yet with the potential to exert a frighteningly disproportionate influence on a future political class. That's because 53% of the British public, when polled by YouGov recently, said Islam is incompatible with British traditions, and the majority of the public, 9 in 10 constituencies, want mass migration stopped. Many of them want it reversed. They want all illegal immigrants deported, and they want many millions of people to go back home. They do not belong here, they are expensive, they are strangers, they don't like us very much, and they should leave. And it's not just fringe people. Actually, the way that this works is they are opening up fissures of latent public sentiment that until now has not been given permission to be expressed, but it's bubbling along in an undercurrent in places where, presumably, Jonathan does not mingle. He probably doesn't pierce his bubble of Guardian columnist social circles very much. And he goes, where does it go next? Perhaps recent legal migrants, as advocated by a Times columnist on Monday, and he's referring to this piece by Jenny Russell, which says, Shabana Mahmood's first job is to block the Boris wave. Now, I won't hold my breath if dedicated Pakistani Muslim Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood, presiding over the 700-strong Islamic network in the Home Office, would decide to send loads of Muslim migrants home, brought here by Boris Johnson. However, the fact that the word Boris wave is used in the title of a Times article, total Max Tempers victory, right? The idea that Sam Bidwell has put forward that indefinite leave to remain can just be cancelled by the Home Secretary, that all of these people can have their ILR expire and can just have to go home, is now mainstream discourse. It's obviously sensible. It avoids the hundreds of billions pounds bill that is coming at us fast down the track as calculated by Carl Williams at the Centre for Policy Studies. And she has just said, here, Jenny, in the pages of the Times, the British public has long been assured that immigration is vital both to public services and economic growth, yet the majority of those arriving under the reckless Boris wave did not fulfil either function. Fewer than a fifth came in as workers, 5.4% were skilled and highly paid, 7% were on health and care visas. The vast majority of those low paid allowed officially to work at less than the going rate for their jobs. 4.6% were on other work visas, the remaining 83% came in as dependents, families, students, or on humanitarian routes. And 95% are never going to be net tax contributors across their lifetime. Why are we battery farming tax dependents? Even students are not always the intellectual and economic assets they once were. The white paper reported that some low-ranking colleagues were used as entry points by people who had no intention of completing the course, the route categorised by the MP Neil O'Brien as the Deliveroo visa. Graduate visas expected to bring in the brightest and allow them to work for 2 years afterwards have proved no more reliable. Fewer than a third go into graduate jobs, and student claims for asylum have tripled in 3 years to 16,500 in 2024, with most applications made just as a course ends, even though little or nothing has changed in their home countries. And many of these are from India and Bangladesh, where there is no war and which are culturally very distant from us. Says the looming issue with the Boris wave arrivals is, as the government knows, but few voters realise, that the first cohort are about to qualify for permission to live in Britain indefinitely. From January 2026 onwards, most who have been here for 5 years can apply for indefinite leave to remain. 400,000 could do so in the next year alone. ILR is usually granted automatically, unless applicants have a serious criminal record. It means that without a change of policy, there is about to be a huge surge in the numbers settling permanently, the majority not net contributors to the economy, and that doesn't even address the cultural concerns. The likely cost to the public purse will be in the billions, and even if they paid vast amounts of taxes, they would still be strangers, and their culture would not recreate Britain at the end of this demographic revolution. So she says, this spring the government appeared to agree. The white paper promised that the standard time before ILR was granted would double from 5 years to 10, with exceptions to the families of British citizens and those who contributed the most. A point system would be used to decide merit. Settlement would be earned, not given as a right. The paper implied the new rules would apply retrospectively to those already here. There would be a public consultation on the details, but Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary at the time, wanted change as swiftly as possible. Mahmood must spur them into action in terms of the civil service. Because it says, whatever the reason, the Home Office certainly isn't moving quickly. I asked when the consultation would begin, and a day and a half later was told before the end of the year. Unless Mahmood does, the damage the Boris wave caused is about to be entrenched. Her party may hesitate, but voters want fairness and control. They will not forgive Labour for failing to do so. This is absolutely the case. This is a sensible policy. It can be done with a stroke of a Whitehall pen with sufficient political will. And the only alternative to this is all these people remaining here for no reason other than Jonathan sees them as co-ethnics, members of the category immigrant, and so thinks we should pay indefinitely for people from the third world to live in the lap of luxury at our expense just because he is afraid of being sent home as well. Well, what he doesn't realise is sensible immigration policies, listening to the concerns of British voters, returning hostile foreign nationals, foreign criminals, illegal migrants, and expensive strangers to their homelands is the way that we actually separate out our political friends and our political enemies. Now, Jonathan has marked himself out as my political enemy here, and he also doesn't seem to like the British host majority population very much if he thinks they're harbouring secret racist views against him all the time, so perhaps he should move and live elsewhere. But if he'd like the opportunity to move, rather than being forced out by someone as militant as Steve Laws, Well, I recommend he takes the political off-ramp and sends the Boris wave home. I'll just end by reading his conclusion, because you can sense the palpable fear in the Guardian columnists that know they're losing the argument on this. Politics at the voter level is so often a direction rather than a destination. Most of us have no coherent overarching vision for how the world should work, much less how we should get there. What we so often describe as politics is in fact a series of shoves, splenetic, emotional, and with a willful blindness to consequence that can be so easily exploited by those with a clear destination in mind. And so the politicians and pundits who now crack the whip on immigration need to be asked right now where this ends. They should be made to say the thing they are judiciously trying to avoid saying, or to renounce it completely. I agree. Bottom line, the idea of mass deportations as a realistic political agenda would have felt as far-fetched 2 decades ago as the idea of your non-white friends being strapped into a plane does now. This in itself should serve as a warning. That is totally true. The reason mass deportations have become a necessity is because millions of illegal migrants and foreign criminals are currently here, and they need to go home. Thank you all very much for watching. Expect a contentious book review next Monday, and the show to return to its regularly scheduled programming towards the end of the week. I will see anyone in Australia down under at CPAC Australia, where I'll be speaking, but until then, take care, God bless, and goodbye.